This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome into Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Today's episode is all about coaching up in regards to helping a new writer on their path to becoming a senior. Just minutes ago, I was proofing a batch of reports from a newer writer, and I couldn't help but realize that you may be a gifted mechanic when you come to work at Blackstone. You may be a gifted writer, but rarely are you both at the same time when you're walking in the door. And even if you were that unicorn, it's highly unlikely that you will understand the ways in which we need to communicate information to meet the customer where they're at, understanding all the nuances that go into explaining the data, let alone making sure your clerical details are in order, the data is good. This last crucial step of communicating the data in the most effective way possible is what it takes to be a great analyst, one who is not only seasoned but understands the customer's point of view. You have to have both in mind at the same time in order to be good at this job. And it's also this combination that sets Blackstone and our analysts apart. So after having proofed this latest batch of reports, I made some notes about things that I think all analysts end up needing to work on when they step in the door until they become a senior analyst and onward, because you really never stop learning in this job. And I want to break down just a few different categories of information, how to deliver it most effectively, and why. So I want to get started by talking about trends. I discuss trends quite a bit on this show, but one thing that can escape a newer analyst at times, I think, is identifying changes in those trends that do not result in a level being cautionary or high, excessive, a red flag, whatever you want to call it, but identifying those marginal increases that still don't look like a good sign. They can still speak to a problem in the early stages. I think it's tempting to call level good when it's still in that average range, or again, it's not jumping off the charts. It's tempting to still call it good. And it's also possible you can overlook a trend when, again, the end result isn't something terrifying from, what we know to be an obvious issue for that particular model, or, maybe we know that it's common for engines to survive with that amount of metal buildup. But identifying those trends when things aren't in a nightmare scenario, looking closer and seeing that, hey, this metal started off low and then it ended up average. And then maybe another sample down the line, it's slightly elevated. Clearly, there's a trend happening. And identifying that is key, because we're all about catching problems when they're in the early stages, not when they get to the point where, you've thrown a rod or a piston is seized or all the things that can go wrong. We want to identify when there is a problem in the early stages, and catching those trends is a key element to that process. We also want to recognize what might bother the customer that doesn't bother us. Now, writing is subjective. And on that note, it's possible that not every writer will want to approach reports this particular way. But I do, in the sense that if I have the room, what I'll make sure to talk about in a comment are changes that, no, they don't present an issue on our end, but if I were to take myself out of the Blackstone University for a moment, so to speak, and try to look at these results from an outsider's perspective, I would definitely want more information on a particular change. Again, it's nothing in the realm of a potential problem, but if I didn't know any better, would I be bothered That's kind of how I want to approach really a wide range of results. And I'll give you an example. A change in an additive level, let's say. If I see a spike in magnesium, now I know that's coming from additive in the oil. Does the customer know that? Certainly possible, depending on how experienced they are. But if they are, say, 3 or 4 samples into their file and they've switched from AMSoil to Valvoline, maybe they assume that there's going to be a change in additive levels. Maybe they don't. But if I see what's clearly a result of a difference in additive recipe, I'll want to go ahead and point that out. Another instance could be a wear-in sample. Maybe they have recently overhauled their Lycoming or Continental, or perhaps they've replaced a cylinder or two. We're bound to find signs of wear-in, like an increase in copper or silicon, just from break-in material and sealer washing out, all well and good. But just because I know to expect that doesn't mean the customer does. So pointing out exactly why these changes are taking place is key. Now, in most wear-in situations, we're going to talk about that. But understanding that whether it's wear-in or a change in additive package or maybe a difference in the physical properties due to use of an additive, let's say, like, for example, if you're running Lucas and the viscosity is thick, pointing that out is something we want to do even if we know that's not a concern for the owner. Because placing us in their shoes can help us understand that, well, this would at least be good to clarify, explain the change, because if nothing else, it communicates that we are paying close attention to the data, the client, and what they might wonder about being a potential issue. Because again, you're only sending in a sample because you care about what it is you own. If you didn't care about what it is you owned, you wouldn't be spending the money, taking the time to obtain a sample, send it in, so on and so forth. Now, on more of a clerical note, we have the common scenario where an owner is sending in a sample that has a mix of oils. They're looking to make a petroleum-based cocktail, one that they think has the magic or the perfect combination of additives, whatever you want to call it. So it's pretty common for people to send in a sample of more than one product being in use. And on that note, when it comes to our clerical details in the system, we can only pick one oil as the oil type. In those cases, you're kind of left to wonder which to choose. At least when you're a newer analyst, it can be tricky to decide which one. Now, one way I'll go about it is if you send in a 020 mixed with a 530 and the viscosity ends up more like a 020, I'll call it a 020. That's where it ended up. You had a mix of the two. One thing's for sure, it's not going to be a concern either way, especially if we see the oil did a good job. This is just a clerical note. But I think it is good knowledge for the customer to have as to why we picked one or the other. Sometimes it's not going to be in either range, especially if you're picking two weights that are pretty far apart. Pick a 020 and a 1540, it might not meet either of those ranges. Might look like a 1030. We pick one, and if it's in a particular range, great. If it's not, still okay, usually. But there is some method there, and if it doesn't end up in either range, again, I wouldn't obsess too much over it. You're picking two that are pretty far apart in some cases. It's mainly a clerical detail, but you want to also dig into the why, from my perspective as a writer, explaining to the customer, here's why we called it this particular weight, and moving forward, how did it do? One thing we'll also see, I think, from a lot of newer analysts is the temptation to look for noise in the data, basically inserting doubt when it's not really necessary, I don't think. There are a lot of unknowns when it comes to explanations for each and every shift in all of the elements we test for, the physical properties. There's no need to go looking for an unknown, basically, is what I'm trying to say. When you have a likely explanation, it's important to communicate that rather than go looking for all the things that maybe don't have a nice or neat explanation, especially when they're not a problem. Case in point, an iron level that is higher than average in the context of a longer than average run. Iron is a metal that tracks closely with the miles. If we know the interval and we can see the iron level on a per mile basis and it's not out of line, it's important to, in my mind, connect the two rather than wonder if that longer run had anything to do with it. Stick to what the numbers can speak to, in my mind, when that information presents itself. Looking for another explanation, well, that may be necessary if, for example, we find a metal that's out of line no matter the oil change interval. Sure, maybe a longer run played a role, but we know that even so, that level is out of line on a per mile, per hour basis. In those cases, we do want to go looking for the unknown. Say the customer didn't let us know about a repair or an activity. The latter is especially important for aircraft situations. We may need to go looking for that unknown, but when we don't, when levels are in the average range and we don't have any troubling trends to point out, that's when it's time to communicate the likely explanations, because truthfully, they're a blessing when they show up, because there's so many ways for elements to shift, for contamination to reach the system, so on and so forth. So that brings today's show to a close. But with that being said, I think this idea of coaching up newer writers is one I'll revisit as the examples come about. I'll keep track of areas of improvement that I think, again, if you walk in the door, even if you know a fair bit about vehicle maintenance or you're a good writer, I think that we'll always find new ways to coach up newer writers and help them on their way to becoming senior analysts. So that's something I'll be keeping in mind. And I hope you all enjoyed this look behind the curtain of what it takes to understand the numbers, both what they mean to us and sussing out what they could mean to those far away from the building but deeply interested and invested in what these results can mean. Thank you all for hanging with me. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.